Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires to talk about the weakest and worst factions currently in the game. Now when I say weakest and worst, I do want to emphasize this point. These factions are of course playable, you can beat the campaign as pretty much anything. You want to play a campaign as Craventail, go right ahead, you'll probably be able to win. You want to play a campaign as the Demon Prince, you'll be able to. Now, I've done a video about the worst legendary lords, but I'm going to do a video about the worst factions. And yes, there is a difference between worst factions and worst legendary lords. But what makes a faction strong, what makes a faction weak? Well, what makes a faction strong is good control, good public order, basically in their provinces, the ability to grow their settlements, a strong economy, and in the context of Immortal Empires and the globe-trotting adventure, the ability to gain a lot of money by looting and sacking settlements. Not all factions have this. The ones that do are the most powerful in the game. The Warriors of Chaos, the Greenskins, and so on. But plenty of factions right now have made the transition from even the Realms of Chaos, the factions that were added in the Realms of Chaos, even some of them have made the transition from a more limited campaign over here to the globe-trotting adventure. They haven't made it, well, some have. Cafe, I'd say, is in a pretty good spot, but actually I would say Cafe is probably the only faction that has done well. Scarbrand as well can do it if you keep winning. To kick it off, at number 5 we have the Dwarves. Here this is a campaign as Grombrindle, who is actually the most playable of all the Dwarven Lords because he gets significant bonuses to make up for their shortcomings, and he has a starting position to deal with the grudges. What are the problems with the Dwarves? Well, the Dwarves do have a couple of things going for them. They do have pretty good heroes, in particular the runesmiths with their Rune of Wrath and Ruin, as well as the Rune of Heart and Home, which are pretty good. Then you have the Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers, both of which are tier 2 units. So if I go over here, you can recruit these pretty quickly from either Clan Barracks or Siege Workshop. I had the Siege Workshop here, I demolished it for more income, but I was able to get those Grudge Throwers for Grombrindle courtesy of that. So you can get really good ranged units, not the best in the game, but really good ranged units that are also solid in melee, because the Quarrelers and Quarrelers with great weapons, they're going to be really good in melee as well. They're not going to have the stats as dedicated melee units, but they're a ranged unit that when they expand all their ammunition or they get in melee, which happens more often than not, will be able to hold their own. And also having pretty good early game artillery, not hell cannon level like Archeon or Kolic can get, but having the ability to recruit pretty good early game artillery from early on is significant for a faction's military power. However, here's where the problems kick in. The grudge meter. This is the biggest issue for the Dwarves, though certainly not the single biggest problem. The first issue with the grudge meter is it is ridiculous. It increases in severity to an extreme level. Here I've solved 2 of the grudges that Grombrindle starts with, and Grombrindle has the best start of any Dwarven Lord. He starts with 2 grudges that are basically the same beat up Malekith. Okay, let's go for that. I did that. I got these runes, I got the Oath Gold, and I reduced the severity. If I had all of these grudges, by turn 20, they would be 120. Each of them would be 40 severity, and I'd be enraged, I'd lose control, I'd lose research rate. And this is the best case scenario in a campaign that went exceptionally well. For the vast majority of campaigns, the vast majority of players, and the majority of the Dwarven legendary lords, things are not going to look like this. If you're playing a Dwarven lord outside of Grombrindle, you can assume that you're going to be playing much, if not most, if not all of their campaign, if you're thinking about Phoric, with this meter filled up. So you're going to be playing at severity and range, which affects your research, your diplomatic relations with fellow dwarves, and your control. The benefit of charge and slayers just doesn't make up for it, to be quite honest with you. So that's the first issue. The grudges are just a pain. They're broken. They increase in severity very quickly. I've talked about this quite a bit on this channel already, but that's because I want to enjoy playing the Dwarves. In fact, when Immortal Empires came out, Grombrindle was one of the first campaigns I picked up and started playing, and it was quite interesting. Then I realized that the only reason I somewhat enjoyed it, despite the broken grudge meter, is because he has significant benefits to make up for many other issues that the dwarves do have. So dwarves have issues getting around, of course. You know, they're slow, right? He gets a significant benefit to all characters faction-wide, 15%. He also gets 15% on top of that. Pretty damn significant. Dwarves have an issue with casualty replenishment because most factions have some hero, or a lot of factions have some hero, or have good casualty replenishment by default to make up for that. But dwarves don't. He, however, boosts casualty replenishment faction-wide, gives global recruitment, because you only have 2 recruitment slots, which is fairly limited. So he gives the faction fairly significant buffs, especially with his powers, right? With his honor, the ancestor skill, which can improve, or the living ancestor event. So I went without research, upkeep, construction cost, some very significant benefits. If you want to play a dwarf campaign, you can't do wrong as Grombrindle, but those are the issues. Dwarves will have a public order issue, not merely, by the way, because the grudge meter, but also because the structure to increase your control is tier 2. Which ties into a really big problem the dwarves have that even Grombrindle can't solve, which is their poor growth. Their growth is really bad. Like here I hold the Granite Hills, I'm only getting 20 growth. It's going to take 2 turns, and this is almost filled. It would take a significant amount of time to get that 1 point, surplus point, let alone 2 surplus points to get to tier 3, which I do need. And the problem is you have to choose between income. At level 1 you have to choose between 200 income, and your income is certainly not the best in the world. You have to choose between 200 income or 15 growth. You can also choose between control in a region, which is already going to be bad because you have no building early on to allow you to do that. No easily accessible building. You can't easily get to tier 2 either. You have financial issues, growth issues, public order issues, research issues, diplomatic issues, casualty replenishment issues, and even despite the fact that the dwarven army like this is incredibly powerful and would be able to beat the crap out of vast majority of early game armies, regardless of what they are, even something like Draika, they really give her a run for their money. The problem for dwarves is that they can only recruit miners, which are pretty crappy in the early tier. Like, their only unit that they can recruit without a structure for it are miners. Consider this versus the high elven archers and spearmen, the goblin archers. I mean, these guys are on the level of goblin spearmen, but orcs have goblin archers with no structure whatsoever in a settlement. So that is certainly a significant issue. Like, dwarves can get a really good early game army, but they need structures for it. They need a barracks, mustering hole, chain to be able to get those units. And you don't necessarily want tier 3 because the Longbeards aren't necessarily great units. Haven't been for a while, but you could get it obviously for the Fane to unlock Fane recruitment. But yeah, there are issues, and that is going to limit your potential because you can't recruit without a building, so you need a building. Problem is, this ties in together with everything else. You can't level up your buildings unless it's very slow. Like, some factions by turn 20 would have, this is the initial starting province, would have these tier 3 or even tier 4 in some cases. This is how slow it is. I've just barely finished getting these all to tier 2, and I'm working on getting tier 3. It's going to take 5 turns. Maybe I can improve it. And this is with the Empower the Guild's commandment to give me more growth. So certainly major problems with the dwarves. They really hamper playing them in any of their campaigns because the name of the game is in Immortal Empires is aggression, is expanding quickly. The dwarves just can't do that. They also don't have the benefit of some other factions that may expand slowly, but those other factions may get a lot of money from looting settlements. Well, you don't get that benefit to post-battle sacking that quite a few factions do get. You just don't have that. Now, there are 2 things that the dwarves also have, 2 cheeses, if you will. The first one is related to lords. You can get a lord that has ancestral blood to reduce construction cost of old buildings in a province, and you can also get a mason to reduce the construction cost for province capital settlement building, so you can get some significant benefits in terms of construction costs for your buildings, despite the fact you're going to have really bad growth. And then of course there is the forge. Like, you get oath gold, it's the special faction research. You get oath gold. Maybe if you could transfer oath gold, like pay oath gold to reduce the grudge meter, maybe that would be a solution to things. But oath gold is special faction research. You can use it to construct weapons. And the thing is, you can also recycle those weapons. So for instance here, I have a sword and an armor of destiny. Like, I have the red axe of Carrick 8 Peaks. That's not going to be useful in particular here. I can go recycle it, and it will give me more than I've actually spent to make it, because it takes 30 for these. You combine 2 of these, get a green weapon, get 4 of these in total, you might be able to get a blue item. Or not, or you can recycle a green item. You can recycle a green item for the cost of 2 of these weapons. So dwarves do have some benefits. The problem is those benefits don't help in any way, shape, or form with the major shortcomings they have in terms of their growth, public order, grudges, economy, casualty replenishment. They just won't help. Like, people say, oh, dwarves have a really powerful endgame army. They do, but it's really, really slow to get to that endgame army, and that's what hampers them. At number 4, we have Kislev. Kislev was designed to be a new player-friendly faction. However, it ended up being far more complicated than that, and actually one of the hardest factions to play in the entire game because of its mechanics. Like the dwarves, they have something that holds them back. In their case, they don't have the very powerful armies that the dwarves have, be it early game or even late game. The dwarves just have a lot more combat power, at least in terms of the ranged units and infantry, though you do have cavalry as Kislev, which certainly makes up for it. In fact, you don't just have cavalry as Kislev, you have bloody bears. Really, really powerful bears when you are playing as Kislev. However, their early game roster is actually incredibly weak. Since they were designed, in my mind, as a new player-friendly faction, their early game units are Kossars, which are a hybrid unit between melee and ranged. The problem is they don't excel at either of those roles. They're gonna be okay in melee, they're gonna be decent in range, but they lack armor piercing, which certainly reduces their combat power by a significant amount. And you may be fighting factions that have a lot of armored units. For instance, over here to the south, you have Draika. If you're playing as Katrin or Castalton, you may end up dealing with heavily armored units. So their early game army isn't particularly that great. You don't have the melee options that other factions have. Your Kossars are not going to stand up to the many melee options quite a lot of factions that surround them do have, like the Skaven, or Azazel, or the Norskins, or the Warriors of Chaos, and your ranged units are just not going to be good enough in a lot of cases. You can make it work, as I have in this particular campaign on Legendary, but I also chose the easiest Legendary Lord as Kislev to do so, specifically Boris, and I took a full advantage of his starting position to really make this situation work. And so Kislev does have some potential, but they are hampered by some of their early game problems. But there is more. Kislev does have special cities. These cities can give you significant buffs. Here in Prague, I get global recruitment duration of -1. However, there's only 3 of these cities. Each of them gives them benefits. Kislev focuses on Ice Guard, Prague focuses on the Griffin Legion and global recruitment, and Ehrengrad focuses on trade. In a nutshell, there's more to it than just that, but there are certainly specializations for each of these cities. However, outside of these cities, the Kislev provinces, the southern oblast, the eastern oblast, the Troll country, and the western oblast, are regions with minor settlements only, so you can't build proper cities in them. And it's not like Kislev is like the ogres who can't build cities in regions at all. No, they can build cities. Like, for instance, here I hold Carrick Vlad, I have a proper city. If I go over here into the fortress, I'll have another proper city. Now, the specialized cities that Kislev have will give you better structures, better economy. For instance, over here, the Grant Market gives me 800 income at level 3. Never mind, the Warriors of Chaos would be getting more from the Dark Fortresses and Vassals, But yeah, you do have some benefits, but you also have downsides in terms of your army. Starting position, you're surrounded by foes. If you play as Catherine, you conceivably have up to 6 legendary lords that you can deal with from the very start. More like 5, 3 to the north and 2 potentially to the south in Trika and Isaac. But you do have certainly significant issues with their starting position unless you're playing Boris Ursus. So if you're playing Castalton, you have 3. If you're playing Catherine, you may have up to 5, maybe even more. And things can get out of control very, very quickly. And beyond that, there is also their special faction resource, Devotion. Now, Devotion, you invoke Devotion, and Devotion gives you faction-wide buffs. For instance, here I've invoked Urson, which gives me attrition to enemy armies within my territory. It gives me a debuff to use in battles that lowers speed and leadership, and also gives me 5 supporters when occupying a settlement. The supporter system, however, of course, is a race between Catherine and Castalton. If you're playing as Boris, you can still get involved and get certain benefits. If you support Castalton, you get a temporary buff that will provide you with public order, with control. If you support Catherine, you get the temporary buff that gives you control and diplomatic relations with Kislev. But it is temporary. It's not the permanent buff that either Catherine or Castalton will have. So Boris does have his own issues. If you're playing, however, as Catherine Castalton, you're going to be spending a lot of time. And the problem with this system, although it's certainly nowhere near as broken as the Grind Meter, to really use the system, you need to invoke one of the gods, and you need to use Devotion Forest, which can be in very high demand, because you can only really gain Devotion through a couple of buildings, through some agent actions, as well as fighting Norscan Warriors of Chaos, Warrior of Chaos or Demons of Chaos factions. Not too big of an issue as Boris, but a far more substantial issue if you're playing Castalton, who may have to deal with Skaven, who may even, or Catherine, who may have to deal with other factions in general, like Skaven, Wood Elves, Orcs. So you might have devotion issues. Devotion is also used for special buildings, the churches, from which you can recruit patriarchs. Now, one benefit is that the patriarchs are incredible heroes. They have really good army replenishment, pretty good in a fight. They can mount bears, and that gives them a lot of combat potential. But some of the starts are really rough. Catherine in particular has a very rough start because unlike Boris and Castalton, she doesn't start with the patriarch. But in general, you're just going to be fighting a lot of enemies, and you don't have the best army for it. Now, Kislev is meant to be this faction that holds the legions of chaos at bay, but they certainly have a lot of problems doing so. Playing a Kislev campaign, especially as Catherine, is one of the hardest in the entire game for a reason. Lack of tools, struggles with growing, constantly under threat from all sides, all possibilities. Just a position, like if you start in a position like Kislev where you're surrounded by potential foes and they can attack you from multiple angles, then that's generally going to be a harder campaign and you will have a lot of fighting to do. If I toggle the Fog of War here, and actually toggle it back on. If I toggle the Fog of War here, if you play as Sylvania, you are surrounded by dwarves and humans that don't particularly like you, so they're quite likely to declare war against you. But as an issue, a faction that's as strong as the vampire counts can deal with. As Kislev, however, that situation is very, very different. It is hard, is brutal, is not easy, and it's not fun in a lot of ways because you're just going to struggle for a lot of the early game to reach your mid to late game potential. And even that mid to late game potential, sure, certain units are great. The War Bears, the Ice Guard, if I look at the building browser, getting things like Streltsy, which I have been able to recruit, getting things like Streltsy, Griffin Legion, Sarguard, War Bears, Ice Guard, Little Groms, a good amount of Ice Mages as well, because Ice Mages are really good. Like, you get the special recruitment and they can give you, they're not just powerful casters, but they can also give you significant bonuses to your army or province, or both, at the same time. There is potential with Kislev. They were designed in a way that was supposed to appeal to new players. The problem is that the way they were designed just doesn't really end up working all that well in Immortal Empires as things currently stand. I do feel like Kislev would be in a much better position if they had a stronger start, especially Catherine. Not necessarily Boris, though he could also use some help as well. They would be in a much better position. They'd have a much more enjoyable campaign. However, as things start, well, Their economy is not particularly great. You do have these structures, like outside of the major cities, which do have the grand market, all the way to the merchant guild hall, which can give you a lot of money. The minor settlements or cities outside of, even cities outside of that, will only give you the caravans, which can only go up to 300. Now 300 for 5 tiers is not great. There are many factions that have a much better economy than Kislev does. Thankfully, they don't struggle with growth, but they do struggle with devotion, they do struggle with the supporter system, they do struggle with the starting position, they do struggle with their early game armies that they can recruit because they don't have armor piercing on them, and they have this hybrid role. So, and that's actually a problem because many factions will have multiple units that they can recruit. The fact that you only can rely on Cossars, even when you get, until you get to level 3, you can only rely on Cossars. Even armored ones does significantly limit your potential as a faction because it limits your flexibility dealing with the myriad of threats that you do have to deal with when you are playing as Kislev. And that is certainly a major contributing factor to the issues they do have. And you don't necessarily want armored Cossars. Armored Cossars are not necessarily the best melee units in the game. Their hybrid role, like just this whole design of hybrid units all across the board from Cossars to Ice Guard, does limit their army potential. Their settlements outside of the 3 big cities, the limited economy they have there does also limit their potential. Plenty of issues all around with Kislev. I do feel like they do get 2 economic buildings with the farms. They can get the farms as well, that can help them out a bit. But their economy is going to be weaker than other factions. And some factions that do have a weak economy can benefit from raiding and sacking settlements. You won't necessarily get that kind of benefit. This is a turn 66 campaign. Now, if I was playing something like the Greenskins or Vampire Counts or something along those lines, I would be far more powerful. Even with a hard start, I would be far more powerful than this. When you see a faction struggling to reach their potential, then you know they have issues. And number 3, and I'm sure this is going to cause a great deal of rage in the comment section, but I would have to say it is the Empire. The more I've played Total War Immortal Empires, the more I've come to the conclusion that having a versatile army, having good mechanics for your faction, and having a good starting position are really important. If you are playing as any of the Imperial factions, well, 3 out of 4 legendary lords for the Empire start in really hard starting position, be it Karl Franz having to deal with the entirety of the Empire burning around him while he has to deal with Secessionists, Grom, Sylvania to the east, Festus over here wiping out Hockland and causing him to lose authority. Or if you're playing as Volkmar, you start, let me just toggle the Fog of War, start right here in the south, surrounded by Cetra, Manfred, plenty of factions to deal with, and really close to one of the end game crises with Nagash at the Black Pyramid of Nagash. So 3 out of 4 have pretty difficult starts. Even if the immediate threats are not too big of an issue, like with Gelt, you still have to deal with the fact that the entire empire is burning, and the more the empire burns, the more you suffer in imperial authority, which carries with the negative consequences. May not feel as much as you would feel with the dwarves, absolutely, but you also don't have the powerhouse of the early game army that the dwarves can get access to. Here's the thing with the empire. Here's the real problem with the Empire beyond their starting position. A broken Imperial authority system that currently really needs some update. You start with -5 growth in all your provinces. It does say a lot about the dwarves that even with this -5 growth, you're going to be in a substantially better position than they are going to be in terms of growth. However, here's the kicker, and you will also have a better economy. However, here is really the kicker for the Empire as I see it. The Imperial army is pretty versatile, very strong. You have a lot access to wizards, to priests that can do a lot of AoE themselves, to captains, to cavalry, to ranged cavalry, to artillery. All of that is incredible. The problem is, all of that is higher tier. And when your entire empire is burning from the very start, you've got problems to deal with. Now, 3 out of the 4 legendary lords deal with broken mechanics, be it the Imperial Authority with France, in Gelt, or the Hunts Marshal expedition system right there in Lustra, though the Hunts Marshal has a much easier starting position. So it's not a good situation regardless of what you pick. That's going to be a problem, and you're going to have issues early on because your early game army, it's not completely terrible, though you are either going to rely on archers or you're eventually going to transition into crossbowmen. Now, crossbowmen are good, but they're nowhere near comparable to many other early game units. Like, consider the fact that crossbowmen, like quarrelers, still require you to get a rally field, a barracks chain, basically, and quarrelers would be the snot out of crossbowmen with relative ease. They're just better units in general. And then to get your cavalry, to get your artillery, to get the artillery that you want. Mortars are lackluster right now at the moment. To get your actual good artillery, you need a tier 4 building to get the Hellstorm. So you do have power, but it's locked behind walls. And in this game, being able to have versatility from the very start is actually something that counts for quite a bit. You don't have the melee or range power of the Dwarves, or the magical potential and faction buffs that Kislev has. Now, some people might wonder, you're rating the Empire lower than Kislev. Yes, I would, because Kislev, for all the problems they have because of the campaign start, can somehow make up for it with all the major buffs that they get, with all the magic. It's not quite as horrible of a situation as it could be, especially on lower difficulties, I imagine. But the Empire situation is horrible. You've got a lot of enemies to fight. You don't necessarily have the best tools to fight them. Vampire counts right now are completely out of control. If you're playing against Gelt and France, the Elector counts over here in the Empire are going to be really, really bad at dealing with anything. Ostermark, Ostland, Hochland, you're going to imagine that they're going to be gone very quickly. Averland and Stirland are also a risk. Nuln is also a risk from the invasion of the Wood Elves. So many threats. Terrible AI partners, limitations in potential of diplomacy. The Elector counts, you can only get a non-aggression pact, trade agreement, and military access. You can't get replenishment while moving through their territory. You can't assign them more targets. And even if you decide to play one of the 2 legendary lords that don't have to deal with this system, you've got plenty of other issues, be it an enormous number of threats if you're playing as Volkmar, or a broken system in its own right if you're playing as the Hunts Marshal, though he has probably the easiest campaign start of all of the Imperial Legendary Lords. So those are the problems, really, with the Empire. It should be in a much better place than this. It's one of the most popular factions in Warhammer, in Total War Warhammer, or Warhammer in general. But it's not really in a good spot. If you can get to the end game, which is a pretty tall order, if you can get to the end game, you will be in a really good spot, but it certainly is harsh. Kislev is harsh. The Dwarves are harsh. Like, all of these factions start out weak and get stronger potentially, though it is a slow march for all of them for different reasons. For Kislev, just an enormous number of enemies very close by. For the Empire, the entire Empire is burning, or an enormous number of enemies next to him, or a broken mechanic. But later on, you can make it work with the Empire, Dwarves, or Kislev. It's just a very long road, slower than other factions, much more perilous than other factions, regardless of the legendary lord that you ultimately end up picking. At number 2, we have the Ogre Kingdoms, because as I've said, Kislev, the Empire, the Dwarves may have issues, but they can get going. They have major early game issues, but once they get going, they can make it work. The Ogres have the exact opposite problem. And I feel that actually contributes a lot to their weakness, because it's one thing to have a faction that has a really hard start, but that can eventually make it work if you play well enough. That is a challenge. It is a problem with the current inverted difficulty that Total War, as in general, be a Warhammer 1, 2, and 3 have always had. But the Ogres are actually going to have a pretty good early game start. Scrag may have a better start than Greases because of the enemies he's fighting, but the Ogre units that you can get from early on, the Ogre builds, are pretty good units. Weak on armor piercing, absolutely, but they have great charge bonuses, and they're difficult, really difficult to take down. You can get ambushed by enemies, fight multiple stacks of early game enemies, and defeat them with relative ease. So the Ogres have a good early game start. You can also take advantage of the caravans that are passing through your territory to get a lot of money to get started. But here's the problem. Significant limitations on how far you can go. Because The ogres rely on their camps. They are the economic hubs for their faction. It's how they will earn their most money outside of looting and sacking settlements. You also need the camps for meat replenishment. Each army has its own meat counter and meat consumption. If they start going down, you're going to start suffering significant negative effects. So you really need to maintain meat on your armies, but you can really only do so outside of fighting a lot of battles. Even then, with a full stack of troops, that may not be enough, or by relying on camps. So camps serve two big purposes: income and meat replenishment, and it's also where you recruit all of your good units, your heroes, all that. You need camps. The problem is camps are limited. In a globe-trotting adventure, you're limited to, through the research tree, we have 4 main texts that give you 4 camps. We have another one for 5, and we get 2 more at the end. 2 more at the end over here. So that's 7. Greases can get another one. So that's 8. Is 8 camps enough for a globe-trotting adventure for the objectives that you're supposed to complete? To deal with the ultimate angry crisis, to be able to recruit large armies to span the globe? No, it is not. You can pack up the camp, you can disband the camp and rebuild one, but it's going to start low level. There are texts to help, texts and skills to help you with that, but ultimately destroying a high level camp like a level 4 level 5 camp is certainly going to be a very, very, very costly endeavor. You may have the money for sacking and looting, but yeah, you're going to fall behind. And that means that despite the fact that ogres do have a pretty good early game start, they're going to fall behind compared to other factions. I think this is actually something we see in the game again and again. Like, when you notice a faction is weak, you can see it in campaigns. For instance, the Dwarfs generally struggle with their campaigns. Kislev generally struggle with the campaign. Like, when the AI is playing them on any difficulty, they will fall behind compared to the factions they're facing. The Empire is going to be a burning wreck regardless of who you're playing. A lot of it is going to be overall, and maybe the Reichland will survive for a decent amount of time, but not that much. Like, actually, the one who does the best of the Empire is the Hunts Marshal, because he's in a much better and safer starting position, but he's got his own issues. But the Ogres as well. The Ogres generally don't accomplish much on the campaign map. Greases and Scrag, yeah, Scrag may take out the Border Princes, but that's going to be the sum of his exploits, really. Other factions can do a lot more. Other factions, even when played by the AI, can do a lot more. Now, the AI doing things or not is not necessarily the full representation of the strength of a faction, because we all know the Warriors of Chaos are really powerful, but right now they're not doing much when they're played by an AI faction, but we know that they have a significant amount of power behind them, so it's not the be-all and end-all what the AI does, but it is just a representation. And the Ogres, either Scrag or Greases, just don't end up accomplishing much. None of the ogre factions, even minor ones, don't end up accomplishing much. They're not genuine threats for you to deal with. They're not problems for you to tackle as a player. They're not significant threats for you to deal with as a player. And so the ogres right now are fairly weak in a lot of ways, because they rely on camps for the bulk of their recruitment. Though they can get some good units from lower level from settlements. The problem is, those lower level settlements, they're just not going to offer them all that much. I think the camp system, like, someone said this to me, you should be able to pack up a camp, keep everything you have in it, and just be able to move it. That would help an enormous amount to the ogres. I don't think it would solve all their economic issues, but it would certainly solve their meat issues and recruitment issues, not their economic issues. They would still be limited economy-wise, though they could make it work by relying on looting and sacking. But yeah, there needs to be some improvements to the ogres. The ogres were in a really good spot in the base game in the Realm of Chaos, because that's a far more limited campaign, a far smaller campaign. But now we have the entire globe, then pretty much the entire world outside of a couple of regions, and you can really see the limitations of the ogres playing out in campaign after campaign after campaign. I admit I'm surprised when, I started thinking about this list, which factions ended up and where and why, but I do believe that the ogres have significant problems right now and do need some improvements, as does the Empire, as do the Dwarves, as does Kislev. And at number 1, in terms of one of the weakest and worst factions currently in the game in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, we have the Daemons of Chaos. When I say Demons of Chaos, I'm not just talking the Demon Prince. I am talking here the whole of every single demonic faction in the game right now. Minus perhaps Scarbrand, but even so, he's got plenty of issues economy-wise. Like, Scarbrand's plan is based on that premise. It's like, if you win battles, you'll do well. But if you start losing, you're just going to lose really, really badly. There is no middle room with that. You're either a steamroller or you're getting annihilated. But what problems do the Demons of Chaos have? Well, they have pretty much everything you can think of. They have issues with their economy because their structures just don't generate a huge amount of money for them. Yeah, if you create a global trotting empire, you may have a lot of income, but until that point, not so much. Compare this structure at level 1, it generates 100. The Warriors of Chaos have a structure that generates 400 at level 1. Sure, they don't get much benefit from occupying minor settlements outside the Dark Fortresses, so that's the idea. But, you know, most regions, most provinces will only have free settlements. You'll earn a lot more from Warriors of Chaos Dark Fortress than you would from occupying an entire province as the demons. In general, regardless of what you're talking about, be it Kugaf, the Demon Prince, Kairos, or Scarbrand, you will generally earn less. Slaanesh has some benefits in terms of this, though Slaanesh has a really, really weak army and has significant problems in their own though. Every single faction, every single legendary lord of the Demons of Chaos, be it undivided or dedicated to a particular god, is supposed to be based around some gimmick mechanic that would really give them power. For Kairos, it's incredibly powerful magical effects as well as the ability to troll people on the map. For Kugaf, it's the plagues. For Scarbrand, it's the ability to spawn blood hosts. For Slaanesh, it's forced vassalization as well as disciple armies. So they do have some gimmick that's supposed to make them powerful. The problem is those gimmicks outside of Scarbrand are just not well suited for a globe-trotting adventure. Limitations. They were designed for more limited campaigns, and you can really feel that when you're playing as the Warriors of Chaos. Like, this is turn 34, and I only hold two entire provinces, and believe me, I've been trying, or rather free provinces over here: the Eternal, the Lagoon, the Tumor, and the Plane of Illusions. In turn 34, other factions would have a lot more income, would have more armies. I only have 1.5 armies basically over here. Regardless of which legendary lord you're going to play as the Warriors of Chaos, you're going to have significant issues expanding. There are factions that can maintain very large and powerful armies, the Greenskins, the Warriors of Chaos. And never mind that the Warriors of Chaos can also have their vassal armies supporting them, so hey, there's that as well. So there's significant benefits playing certain factions. The Demons of Chaos are just on the back end because they were designed for a more limited campaign. That's an issue they share with the Ogres. That's also something that hampers Kislev because they were designed for a different map than what they have in Immortal Empires. But Kislev does scale well. The Demons and Ogres just don't. So you're going to have issues recruiting a large number of troops, maintaining large armies. And that is the key to success in every campaign in Immortal Empires currently. Being able to expand as aggressively and quickly across the map as possible. Being able to deal with the myriad of foes that are against you. And while certainly Kairos and Scarbrand do end up doing far better, Kairos because of magic, Scarbrand because of the limitless armies that you can spawn, the other ones, they're just far more limited. And again, I stress the point about Scarbrand. If you win, that's great. If you start struggling, if you start having difficult battles, and you will, especially on the higher difficulties, you may fall behind very quickly and in a fairly brutal manner. So there are problems. Like, the Demons of Chaos are their economy seems to be based around the idea of sacking settlements, right? Sacking, looting settlements, or raising settlements, depending on what you're playing as. The issue with that game plan is that it can work, it can generate a good amount of income, it can help you get very far, but it has, of course, its own problems, especially when you're playing a faction that doesn't have the ability to build large armies across the map to take advantage of it. The Greenskins can do that, the Warriors of Chaos can do that, you can't. Hell, Norska can do that. Norska has a really good economy, but there is another point. It's the economy behind the looting and sacking. That also is important. The reason the Warriors of Chaos and Greenskins are two of the best factions in the game currently isn't the fact that they can get in a lot of money by looting and sacking settlements. It's also that on top of that, they have a really good economy back home. That is crucial for them. That is crucial to their support. They have good growth, control, you name it. You don't have those benefits. You don't even have good control necessarily if you're playing Demon Prince. You may struggle with that. You may struggle with control. You may struggle with maintaining control of your provinces. You may struggle with growing your provinces. Everyone has their issues, right? Scarbrand is too reliant on looting and sacking. Kugaf is too slow. Kairos doesn't have good replenishment. It's like, it's a mixed bag. So every single one of them has their own weakness, has their own problems. And you can make it work with some of them, no, not all of them. I mean, you can make it work with any legendary lord and any faction, don't get me wrong on this, but some are just going to be far, far slower than others. And I think of all the factions currently in the game, the Demons of Chaos, especially the Demon Prince, but Demons of Chaos in general, are just in the worst position of any faction in the game. That's just how things currently are, because they are struggling at expanding. They're struggling at maintaining large armies. They're struggling growing their provinces, even controlling their provinces because of the way the corruption works, because they might be dealing with multiple sets of corruptions, all competing for dominance in a particular province, which is going to cause you issues. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications. Stay tuned for more. Join the Discord if you want to be kept up to date with the content. And I do want to emphasize this. I make these videos because these factions need help. Hell, I would love to play a campaign and not be frustrated as the Dwarfs or Kislev, or the Nightmare that is Kislev rather. I would love to play a campaign as the Empire and not feel constantly frustrated. I was just playing a campaign as Volkmar, for instance, earlier, and it's like I realized, holy crap, I am completely outmatched compared to what I'm dealing with. I still can deal with it, you know, playing this game for playing Total War for years and years and years, and playing Total War Warhammer for years and years will help you get through that. But you then notice where the cracks are, so to speak. And they do exist. There are problems. They need improvement. That's why it's called a beta. Stay tuned.